In early 1943, the North African campaign entered a transitional phase. Following the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria under Operation Torch in November 1942, Axis forces in Tunisia found themselves compressed between advancing Anglo-American formations from the west and the British Eighth Army approaching from the east. On paper, the strategic balance had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. They possessed numerical superiority, control of sea lanes, and an expanding industrial base capable of sustaining prolonged operations. Yet, these advantages did not automatically translate into operational effectiveness on the ground. For the United States Army, North Africa represented its first large-scale engagement against a modern, experienced enemy. American formations arriving in Tunisia were products of an institutional system shaped by interwar doctrine, training assumptions, and organizational compromises made during rapid mobilization. Command structures were still being tested. Combined arms integration remained uneven. Senior leadership was learning how to operate within a coalition framework while simultaneously confronting an opponent that had already adapted through years of combat in Europe and the Mediterranean. German forces in Tunisia, though strategically constrained and increasingly isolated, retained operational flexibility. Commanded by officers accustomed to maneuver warfare, they exploited interior lines, tactical concentration, and the uneven distribution of Allied units across difficult terrain. The geography of central Tunisia, mountainous, compartmentalized, and poorly mapped, further amplified the consequences of doctrinal rigidity and command inexperience. The engagements, collectively known as the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, emerged from this convergence of factors. What unfolded was not a single battle in the conventional sense, but a sequence of interconnected actions shaped by doctrine, command relationships, intelligence assessments, and logistical limitations. The outcome exposed critical mismatches between American institutional expectations and the operational realities of modern land warfare. This episode matters not because it represents a dramatic setback, but because it functioned as a systemic stress test. The Battle of Kasserine Pass revealed how doctrine performed when applied under combat conditions, how command systems absorbed shock, and how rapidly an army could adapt when foundational assumptions were challenged. It stands as a case study in the relationship between military theory and operational reality within the wider context of the Second World War. The operational context that produced the Battle of Kasserine Pass was shaped well before the first German units moved through the central Tunisian mountains in February 1943. Its origins lay in the strategic decisions surrounding Operation Torch, the rapid expansion of the United States Army, and the institutional assumptions embedded in American doctrine during the interwar period. By the time U.S. forces entered sustained combat in Tunisia, many of the structural conditions for failure were already in place. Operation Torch was conceived primarily as a strategic maneuver rather than an operationally mature campaign. The Allied objective was to secure North Africa, open the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, and apply pressure on Axis forces from the west while British forces advanced from Egypt. The landings in Morocco and Algeria succeeded with minimal resistance, reinforcing the perception within Allied headquarters that the transition to offensive operations would be relatively straightforward. However, the operation did not immediately resolve the problem of Axis forces in Tunisia.
Instead, it created a race condition in which both sides sought to occupy key terrain and establish forward bases before the front stabilized. For the United States Army, this transition occurred under conditions of institutional strain. American ground forces in North Africa were assembled from formations that had trained extensively but lacked combat experience. Their doctrine emphasized firepower, methodical movement, and centralized control. These principles reflected lessons drawn from World War I and reinforced by interwar training exercises conducted in environments that did not replicate the constraints of mountainous terrain or the tempo of mobile warfare. While U.S. doctrine acknowledged combined arms operations in theory,
In practice, coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support remained uneven. Command relationships further complicated the situation. American units in Tunisia operated within a coalition framework dominated by British operational experience and strategic priorities. While overall Allied command structures existed, tactical coordination between U.S. and British formations was often improvised. Differences in doctrine, terminology, and command culture limited effective integration. At the same time, American commanders were expected to exercise independent operational judgment in sectors that were geographically dispersed and logistically fragile. The establishment of the U.S. Second Corps in central Tunisia exemplified these challenges. Tasked with holding a wide front across difficult terrain, Second Corps was responsible for protecting key passes through the Atlas Mountains while preparing for offensive operations toward the Tunisian coast. The Corps' area of responsibility was extensive. Its units were frequently repositioned, and its logistical support was constrained by limited road networks and underdeveloped supply depots.
These conditions forced commanders to disperse forces in order to cover terrain, reducing mutual support and diluting combat power. Intelligence assessments at this stage were shaped by optimistic assumptions about Axis capability. Allied planners believed that German and Italian forces in Tunisia were operating under severe logistical constraints and lacked the capacity for sustained offensive action. While these assessments were not entirely unfounded, they underestimated the operational flexibility retained by German formations and the willingness of Axis commanders to concentrate forces locally to achieve temporary superiority. Reports indicating German troop movements and armor concentrations were often interpreted as defensive preparations, rather than indicators of offensive intent. Terrain played a decisive role in magnifying these misjudgments. Central Tunisia is characterized by broken mountain ranges, narrow defiles, and limited avenues of approach. Control of passes, such as Kasserine, was essential for maneuver, but also created natural choke points vulnerable to concentrated attack. American units occupying these positions were frequently isolated from one another, with limited lateral communication and delayed reinforcement capability. Doctrine that emphasized holding ground and maintaining linear defenses proved ill-suited to this environment. German operational doctrine, by contrast, prioritized maneuver, local concentration, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses. Axis commanders in Tunisia, drawing on experience from earlier campaigns, understood that strategic inferiority did not preclude operational initiative. By identifying sectors held by inexperienced or overextended Allied units, they sought to disrupt Allied preparations, delay offensive operations, and inflict disproportionate losses. These objectives did not require territorial permanence. They required temporary operational success. A mismatch between American expectations and German intent became increasingly evident in January and early February 1943. Skirmishes and probing attacks revealed vulnerabilities in Allied dispositions. Yet, these encounters were often interpreted as limited actions rather than components of a broader operational design. The absence of a unified operational picture, combined with fragmented command authority, hindered timely adaptation. Decisions regarding force concentration, reserve placement, and air-ground coordination were made within narrow organizational silos. Logistics further constrained American responses. Supply lines from Algerian ports to forward positions in Tunisia were long and exposed, limiting the availability of fuel, ammunition, and maintenance support. Armored units in particular faced difficulties sustaining mobility, undermining one of the few areas in which American forces could theoretically offset German experience. The requirement to conserve resources reinforced defensive postures and discouraged aggressive maneuver. By mid-February, the conditions for a German offensive through the Kasserine region were firmly established. American forces were dispersed, doctrinally oriented toward static defense, and operating under command structures still adapting to coalition warfare. Intelligence assessments failed to anticipate the scale and coordination of the impending attack.
Terrain amplified the effects of these weaknesses, while logistical limitations reduced flexibility at the tactical and operational levels. The Battle of Kasserine Pass did not begin as an abrupt rupture, but as the logical outcome of accumulated structural and doctrinal decisions. Understanding these preconditions is essential to analyzing the actions that followed. The engagements that unfolded were less a test of individual unit performance than an examination of how an institution's assumptions functioned under operational pressure.
In this sense, Kasserine represented not an anomaly, but an exposure of systemic realities that had yet to be fully confronted. The German offensive actions that culminated in the Battle of Kasserine Pass were not improvised reactions to Allied pressure, but the result of deliberate operational calculations made under strategic constraint. By early February 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia faced an unfavorable long-term situation. Allied control of the sea and air limited reinforcement and resupply, while converging Allied ground forces threatened eventual encirclement. Within these limits, German commanders sought to regain the initiative at the operational level by exploiting Allied inexperience, dispersed deployments, and doctrinal rigidity. Axis command in Tunisia was divided between two primary headquarters. In the north, the 5th Panzer Army under Hans-Jürgen von Arnim faced British and Allied forces advancing from Algeria. In the south, elements of the German-Italian Panzer Army Africa, retreating from Libya after the defeat at El Alamein, were commanded by Erwin Rommel. Although strategic unity of command was imperfect, both commanders recognized an opportunity to strike U.S. forces in central Tunisia before Allied operational cohesion solidified. German intelligence assessments identified the American-held sector as the weakest portion of the Allied line. U.S. formations were newly arrived, widely dispersed, and lacked combat-tested command systems. The passes through the Atlas Mountains offered access routes that, if exploited, could disrupt Allied logistics, force redeployments, and delay planned offensives toward the Tunisian coast. The objective was not decisive strategic victory, but operational disruption under favorable local conditions. The planning process reflected established German operational doctrine. Rather than attempting a broad-front advance, Axis commanders emphasized concentration of mobile forces against selected objectives. Armored and mechanized units were assembled to achieve temporary superiority at decisive points, supported by artillery and close air support coordinated at the tactical level. Flexibility and rapid exploitation were prioritized over holding ground. These principles had been refined through earlier campaigns and were well understood by German staff officers. In contrast, Allied command arrangements in the central sector limited effective response. The U.S. Second Corps, responsible for a wide frontage, lacked depth and reserves capable of rapid maneuver. Units were positioned to defend terrain rather than to counterattack. Communication between Corps headquarters, subordinate divisions, and neighboring Allied units was inconsistent, complicating the transmission of intelligence and orders. Air support, while available in theory, was not fully integrated into ground operations, reducing responsiveness during fast-moving engagements. The initial German attacks in February targeted forward Allied positions east of the Atlas passes. These actions demonstrated a clear pattern. Reconnaissance identified weak points, armored thrusts exploited gaps, and supporting fires suppressed isolated defensive positions. American units, trained to expect linear engagements and centralized control, struggled to adapt to rapidly shifting situations. Requests for reinforcement and air support often moved through multiple command layers, delaying response and reducing effectiveness. German forces capitalized on these delays by maintaining operational tempo. Even when Allied resistance stiffened, Axis units disengaged selectively, repositioned, and renewed attacks elsewhere. This fluidity contrasted sharply with American tendencies to hold assigned sectors until explicit orders authorized withdrawal or maneuver. The result was a series of localized penetrations that cumulatively destabilized the Allied defensive posture.
The decision to advance toward Kasserine Pass itself reflected operational logic rather than opportunism. The pass served as a critical corridor through the mountains, connecting the eastern plains with Allied rear areas. Penetration through this route threatened supply depots, command posts, and airfields, forcing the Allies to divert forces from planned offensives. German commanders understood that even a temporary breakthrough could impose disproportionate operational costs on an opponent still assembling combat power. At the same time, German planning acknowledged inherent limitations. Logistical shortages restricted the duration and depth of any advance. Fuel and ammunition stocks were finite, and prolonged exploitation risked overextension. These constraints reinforced the emphasis on limited objectives and controlled withdrawals once operational goals were achieved. The offensive was therefore designed as a calculated application of pressure rather than a pursuit of decisive encirclement. Allied intelligence during this phase failed to fully appreciate the coherence of German intent. Reports of enemy movements were often interpreted as localized reactions rather than components of a coordinated offensive plan. The absence of a centralized analytical framework capable of synthesizing tactical reports into an operational assessment contributed to delayed recognition of the threat. As a result, Allied command adjustments lagged behind events on the ground. The opening engagements around Kasserine exposed the consequences of these contrasting approaches. German forces achieved surprise not through secrecy, but through speed, concentration, and exploitation of procedural delays. American units, while often fighting with determination at the tactical level, lacked the doctrinal and organizational flexibility required to counter maneuver-oriented operations.
Commanders faced rapidly evolving situations without established mechanisms for decentralized decision-making. By the time the scale of the German advance became clear, Allied forces were already reacting rather than shaping events. Reinforcements were rushed forward under adverse conditions, often without sufficient reconnaissance or coordination. Air support improved as the battle progressed, but initial shortcomings allowed Axis units to achieve their immediate operational objectives. This phase of the Battle of Kasserine Pass illustrates the practical implications of doctrine under combat conditions. German operational methods did not rely on superior numbers or resources, but on the effective application of established principles against an opponent still translating theory into practice. The resulting imbalance was not a reflection of inherent national capability, but of institutional readiness at a specific moment in the war. Understanding this dynamic is essential for evaluating subsequent Allied responses. The German offensive created a crisis that forced rapid reassessment of command arrangements, doctrinal assumptions, and coordination mechanisms. The events that followed would demonstrate whether the U.S. Army could adapt its institutional framework under pressure, or whether the gap between doctrine and operational reality would continue to shape outcomes. As German forces advanced toward Kasserine Pass, the limitations of Allied command and control became increasingly apparent. The unfolding situation tested not only tactical competence, but the institutional structures through which information flowed, decisions were made, and authority was exercised. In this phase of the battle, outcomes were shaped less by enemy action alone than by how Allied command systems processed stress, uncertainty, and rapidly changing operational conditions. At the center of the American response stood the headquarters of U.S. Second Corps, commanded by Lloyd Friedendahl. Friedendahl's command style reflected prevailing U.S. Army doctrine, which emphasized centralized control and adherence to predefined plans. His headquarters was positioned well to the rear, physically distant from frontline units. While intended to ensure survivability and continuity of command, this separation limited situational awareness and slowed decision-making at critical moments. Information reaching Corps headquarters was fragmented and often delayed. Reports from subordinate units arrived through multiple channels, frequently lacking context or consistency. The absence of a robust system for synthesizing battlefield intelligence into an operational picture hindered effective response. As German attacks intensified, Corps staff struggled to distinguish between localized setbacks and broader operational threats.
This uncertainty reinforced cautious decision-making and discouraged rapid concentration of forces. Friedendahl's orders reflected an institutional preference for holding terrain rather than trading space for time. Units were instructed to maintain positions even as their flanks became exposed and supporting elements withdrew. This approach increased the vulnerability of isolated formations and limited the ability of commanders on the ground to maneuver in response to changing conditions. Requests for withdrawal or repositioning often required approval from higher headquarters, introducing delays that German forces exploited. At the divisional and regimental levels, American officers faced conflicting pressures. On one hand, they were expected to adhere strictly to orders emphasizing positional defense. On the other, the tactical situation demanded flexibility, initiative, and rapid adaptation. The lack of doctrinal clarity regarding decentralized decision-making created hesitation. In several instances, local commanders delayed action while awaiting guidance, allowing German units to exploit gaps and penetrate defensive lines.
Communication infrastructure further compounded these problems. Terrain interfered with radio transmissions, and wired communications were vulnerable to disruption. Liaison between neighboring units was inconsistent, leading to uncoordinated responses and duplication of effort. These issues were not unique to the Kasserine sector, but their effects were magnified under the pressure of a coordinated enemy offensive. Allied air support during this phase remained uneven. Although Allied air forces possessed numerical superiority, coordination with ground units was limited. Requests for close air support passed through centralized channels that prioritized planned missions over emergent tactical needs. As a result, air power was often applied too late or against targets no longer relevant to the immediate ground situation. German units, benefiting from closer integration between ground and air elements, were able to move with relative freedom during critical periods. Higher-level Allied command recognized the deteriorating situation, but faced its own constraints. Overall, Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower was responsible for coordinating a multinational force operating across a wide front. His headquarters relied on reports from subordinate commands that underestimated the scale and coherence of the German offensive in its early stages. Decisions regarding reinforcement and reorganization were therefore reactive, arriving only after local setbacks accumulated. The response to the German breakthrough at Kasserine Pass revealed the cumulative effects of these command deficiencies. Reinforcements were committed piecemeal, often without clear operational objectives. Units unfamiliar with the terrain and lacking integration with existing forces were inserted into the line under pressure. This approach increased congestion, strained logistics, and limited the effectiveness of newly arrived formations. Despite these challenges, American units demonstrated resilience at the tactical level. Small unit actions, particularly by artillery and infantry elements, slowed the German advance and inflicted losses. However, these localized successes were not systematically exploited due to the absence of coordinated operational direction. The gap between tactical performance and operational effectiveness remained pronounced. German commanders continued to exploit Allied command rigidity by shifting axes of advance and applying pressure where resistance appeared weakest. Their ability to disengage and reorient operations contrasted with Allied efforts to restore linear defenses. Each German maneuver forced Allied headquarters to reassess dispositions, consuming time and attention while reducing initiative. The experience of this phase underscored a fundamental institutional issue. U.S. Army doctrine had not fully reconciled the need for centralized planning with the demands of decentralized execution in fluid combat environments. Training emphasized compliance and coordination, but provided limited guidance on exercising initiative under conditions of uncertainty. The Battle of Kasserine Pass exposed this imbalance in a manner that could not be ignored. By the time Allied command structures began to adjust, simplifying chains of command, delegating authority, and improving air-ground coordination, the immediate crisis had largely run its course. German forces, constrained by logistics and broader strategic considerations,
began to withdraw from forward positions. The operational initiative shifted, but the lessons of the preceding days were unmistakable. This phase of the battle demonstrated that doctrine and organization are not abstract concepts, but practical determinants of combat performance. At Kasserine, the effectiveness of Allied forces was shaped less by individual courage or material strength than by how command systems functioned under stress.
The consequences of these institutional choices would drive significant reforms in the weeks that followed, influencing the conduct of subsequent operations across the North African theater. As the German offensive reached its culmination around Kasserine Pass, the interaction between operational limits and institutional adaptation became increasingly visible. This phase was defined not by a decisive breakthrough, but by the gradual exhaustion of German momentum and the parallel, uneven stabilization of Allied defenses. The outcome was shaped by logistics, command friction, and the inherent constraints of maneuver warfare conducted under unfavorable strategic conditions. By mid-February 1943, German forces advancing through the Kasserine sector had achieved their immediate operational objectives. They had penetrated Allied defenses, forced a temporary withdrawal of US units, disrupted rear area logistics, and compelled Allied commanders to divert forces from planned offensives. However, these gains came at increasing cost. The further Axis units advanced westward, the more their logistical vulnerabilities were exposed. Fuel shortages, limited ammunition stocks, and strained maintenance capacity constrained continued exploitation. German operational doctrine recognized these limitations. The offensive was never intended as a deep penetration aimed at decisive strategic outcomes. Instead, it was conceived as a limited operation designed to impose delay and disruption. As resistance stiffened and Allied responses improved, the calculus shifted. Continuing the advance risked overextension without commensurate operational benefit. This assessment guided the decision to slow and eventually halt further movement through the pass. On the Allied side, the pressure of the German advance forced incremental adaptation. Although command deficiencies persisted, several corrective measures began to take effect during this phase. Artillery coordination improved as units established clearer fire control procedures and concentrated fires against advancing armor. Defensive positions were reorganized to emphasize depth rather than linear frontage, reducing the vulnerability of isolated strongpoints. Air-ground coordination, while still imperfect, became more responsive. Allied air units increasingly targeted German columns operating in confined terrain, exploiting choke points along mountain roads. The impact of these attacks was less about immediate destruction than about disrupting movement and consuming scarce fuel. German units were forced to disperse, slow their advance, and allocate resources to protection rather than maneuver. The cumulative effect of these adjustments altered the operational balance. German commanders encountered growing resistance that no longer collapsed under initial pressure. Counterattacks, though limited in scope, imposed additional friction and uncertainty. Allied forces began to contest key terrain more effectively, denying the Germans the freedom of movement that had characterized earlier phases of the offensive. Logistics played a decisive role in shaping the end of this phase. German supply lines, already stretched, were vulnerable to interdiction and subject to Allied air superiority. The inability to replenish fuel and ammunition at the required rate imposed hard limits on operational tempo. Even successful tactical engagements consumed resources that could not be readily replaced. In contrast, Allied logistical capacity, though constrained in the forward areas, benefited from a broader strategic base and improving supply arrangements. Command decisions on both sides reflected these realities. German leadership assessed that continued offensive action would not yield proportional operational returns. The risk of becoming decisively engaged against increasingly organized Allied defenses outweighed the benefits of further advance. Orders were issued to consolidate gains, conduct fighting withdrawals where necessary, and prepare for a transition back to defensive operations. For Allied commanders, the immediate objective shifted from halting the advance to restoring coherence.
Efforts focused on re-establishing unit integrity, improving communication, and clarifying command responsibilities. While these measures did not instantly resolve systemic issues, they reduced the likelihood of further uncontrolled retreats and stabilized the front. The terrain of the Kasserine region continued to shape outcomes during this period. Narrow passes and limited road networks constrained large-scale maneuver for both sides. For German units, these constraints magnified logistical difficulties and increased exposure to air attack. For Allied forces, they limited the effectiveness of counteroffensive action, but aided defensive consolidation. The geography imposed a natural pause on operations, reinforcing decisions driven by logistical and organizational factors. By the time German forces disengaged from their forward positions, the character of the engagement had changed. What began as an offensive exploiting Allied weakness ended as a controlled withdrawal governed by resource constraints. The absence of a decisive tactical defeat for either side underscores the operational nature of the outcome. The Germans achieved disruption, but not destruction. The Allies absorbed the shock, but paid a significant institutional cost. This phase highlighted a critical distinction between tactical success and operational sustainability. German forces demonstrated the ability to generate localized superiority and exploit enemy weakness, but lacked the means to convert that advantage into lasting operational control. Allied forces, despite early failures, benefited from depth, adaptability, and a strategic context that allowed recovery.
The stabilization following the German withdrawal did not mark an immediate transformation in Allied effectiveness. Many deficiencies remained unresolved, and the institutional lessons of Kasserine had yet to be fully integrated. However, the immediate crisis passed, creating space for reflection and reform. Command relationships were re-evaluated, doctrinal assumptions questioned, and organizational changes initiated. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, viewed through this phase, illustrates the limits of doctrine when confronted by material and organizational constraints. Operational reality imposed boundaries on both sides, shaping decisions as much as intent. The engagements did not produce a decisive victor, but they clarified the conditions under which future operations would be conducted. The consequences of this realization would extend beyond Tunisia, influencing Allied command practices and doctrinal development for the remainder of the war. The aftermath of the Battle of Kasserine Pass initiated a process of institutional reassessment within the Allied command structure that extended beyond the immediate tactical lessons of the engagement. The reverses suffered in central Tunisia were interpreted not as isolated battlefield failures, but as indicators of systemic shortcomings in doctrine, leadership selection, and command organization. This phase was defined by corrective action, some rapid, others more deliberate, aimed at aligning institutional practice with the operational realities exposed in February 1943. At the strategic level, Allied leadership concluded that deficiencies in command effectiveness posed a greater risk than material shortages or numerical imbalance. The U.S. Army had entered combat with adequate manpower and equipment, but without a tested framework for employing those resources under modern battlefield conditions. Kasserine demonstrated that institutional assumptions regarding control, coordination, and initiative were misaligned with the tempo and complexity of maneuver warfare. One of the most consequential responses involved changes in senior leadership. Confidence in the command of U.S. Second Corps had been undermined by the performance of the headquarters during the crisis. Decision-making delays, rigid control measures, and limited situational awareness were identified as critical contributors to the initial breakdown. As a result, command of Second Corps was reassigned to George S. Patton, whose reputation for discipline and operational rigor aligned with the perceived need for immediate reform. Patton's appointment reflected broader institutional priorities rather than a belief in individual leadership as a panacea. His mandate was explicit: restore order, enforce standards, and implement doctrinal principles more consistently. Upon assuming command, Patton emphasized clarity of authority, forward command presence,
and strict adherence to operational procedures. Headquarters were repositioned closer to the front, improving communication and responsiveness. While these measures were not novel in concept, their rigorous application represented a shift from theoretical doctrine to enforced practice. Concurrently, Allied command relationships were streamlined. Efforts were made to reduce ambiguity in the chain of command and improve coordination between ground and air forces. The previous fragmentation, in which air support operated largely independently of ground requirements, was recognized as incompatible with mobile operations. New procedures were introduced to accelerate air-ground coordination, enabling more timely and flexible application of air power in support of ground maneuver. Doctrinal reassessment extended to force employment.
The dispersal of units across wide fronts, previously justified by terrain considerations and defensive assumptions, was increasingly viewed as a liability. Emphasis shifted toward concentration of combat power, establishment of operational reserves, and acceptance of temporary withdrawals to preserve force integrity. These adjustments did not represent abandonment of existing doctrine, but reinterpretation informed by combat experience. Training practices also came under scrutiny. Pre-war and early wartime training had emphasized standardized solutions and compliance with orders. Kasserine revealed the limitations of this approach in fluid combat environments. Greater emphasis was placed on developing initiative among subordinate commanders, encouraging timely decision-making within the framework of higher intent. This shift required cultural as well as procedural change, challenging deeply ingrained institutional norms. Logistics, while not the primary cause of the defeat, were identified as an enabling factor that required closer integration with operational planning. Supply arrangements in Tunisia had evolved incrementally, often lagging behind operational movement. Post-Kasserine adjustments focused on improving forward supply distribution, maintenance support, and redundancy in transportation networks. These changes enhanced operational flexibility and reduced vulnerability to disruption. The German response to these Allied adjustments was constrained by broader strategic developments. Axis forces in Tunisia faced increasing pressure from converging Allied armies and diminishing access to reinforcement. While German units retained tactical proficiency, their capacity to exploit Allied weaknesses narrowed as those weaknesses were addressed. The window of opportunity that had enabled the Kasserine offensive closed rapidly. Importantly, Allied reforms were not uniformly applied or immediately effective. Institutional change occurred unevenly across units and commands. Some formations adapted quickly, integrating new procedures and command styles. Others required additional combat experience to internalize lessons. The process was iterative, shaped by continued engagement rather than formal doctrine alone. The significance of this phase lies in its demonstration of institutional adaptability under pressure. The U.S. Army did not respond to Kasserine by attributing failure to circumstance or enemy advantage alone. Instead, it undertook a critical evaluation of its own structures and practices. This willingness to acknowledge shortcomings and implement corrective measures distinguished the Allied response and contributed to subsequent operational success. Kasserine thus functioned as a catalyst rather than a terminal failure. The lessons drawn from the engagement influenced not only the remainder of the North African campaign, but also planning and execution in later theaters. Adjustments in command philosophy, force employment, and coordination mechanisms informed Allied operations in Sicily, Italy, and eventually Northwest Europe. This phase underscores the central analytical theme of the battle. Doctrine, when untested, remains an abstraction. Only through confrontation with operational reality does its effectiveness become clear. The Battle of Kasserine Pass forced the U.S. Army to reconcile institutional theory with battlefield practice. The reforms that followed did not eliminate friction or guarantee success, but they narrowed the gap between expectation and reality. By early March 1943, Allied forces in Tunisia were reorganized, reoriented, and better prepared for sustained operations. The immediate consequences of Kasserine were still being absorbed, but the direction of institutional change was evident.
The engagement had exposed vulnerabilities, but it had also initiated a process of adaptation that would shape Allied performance for the remainder of the war. The operational environment following the Battle of Kasserine Pass provided an immediate test of whether Allied institutional adjustments could translate into improved battlefield performance. This phase was characterized not by a single decisive engagement, but by a series of coordinated actions that demonstrated evolving command practices, more effective integration of combat arms, and a narrowing gap between doctrine and operational execution. With the reorganization of U.S. Second Corps under new leadership, Allied forces adopted a more deliberate operational posture. The emphasis shifted from static defense toward controlled maneuver, supported by concentrated firepower. Commanders were encouraged to maintain forward presence, improve situational awareness, and exercise initiative within clearly defined operational intent. These changes were reflected in how units were deployed, how reserves were managed, and how responses to German action were coordinated. Artillery employment illustrated this shift most clearly. American artillery units, already technically proficient, began to operate within more coherent fire control frameworks. Fires were massed rapidly in response to enemy movement, rather than being allocated in advance to fixed defensive sectors. This flexibility increased the lethality of Allied responses and reduced the effectiveness of German armored thrusts. The integration of forward observers and improved communication networks enhanced responsiveness, allowing artillery to shape engagements rather than merely react to them. Air-ground coordination continued to improve as command procedures were refined. Allied air units increasingly operated in direct support of ground operations, focusing on interdiction and close support missions tied to operational priorities. The ability to redirect air assets in response to emerging ground threats reduced the freedom of movement previously enjoyed by German forces. Although weather and terrain still imposed constraints, the combined application of air and ground power altered the operational calculus. German forces, for their part, faced growing constraints. The cumulative effects of logistical shortages, sustained Allied pressure, and diminishing strategic options limited their ability to conduct large-scale maneuver operations. While German units remained tactically capable, their operational freedom was increasingly restricted. Attempts to probe Allied defenses encountered more cohesive responses, with reserves committed in a timely manner and counterattacks coordinated across multiple units. The contrast with earlier phases of the campaign was evident in command behavior. Allied headquarters demonstrated greater willingness to concentrate forces and accept calculated risk. Decisions were made more rapidly, supported by clearer information flows and improved staff coordination. The previous tendency to await detailed instructions from higher headquarters gave way to more decentralized execution, consistent with operational intent. Terrain continued to influence operations, but its impact was increasingly mitigated by experience. Allied units developed a better understanding of movement corridors, defensive positions, and logistical routes within the central Tunisian landscape. This familiarity reduced friction and improved the effectiveness of maneuver. German forces, operating under increasing resource constraints, found it more difficult to exploit terrain advantages as Allied situational awareness improved. These developments were not the result of a single reform or leadership change, but of cumulative institutional learning. Training practices adapted in real time, with lessons disseminated through after-action reports and staff briefings. Commanders emphasized consistency and discipline, reinforcing procedures that had proven effective while discarding those that had failed under combat conditions. Importantly, this phase did not eliminate all shortcomings. Allied operations remained cautious, reflecting an awareness of earlier failures and an ongoing effort to balance aggression with control. Mistakes persisted, and coordination challenges occasionally re-emerged. However, the systemic failures that had characterized the opening of the Kasserine engagement were no longer dominant. From an analytical perspective, this period illustrates the dynamic relationship between doctrine and experience. Doctrine provided a framework, but its practical application required adaptation informed by operational reality. The U.S. Army's ability to adjust command practices, integrate combat arms, and refine decision-making under pressure marked a transition from theoretical preparedness to practical competence. The German response to this shift underscored its significance. As Allied effectiveness increased, German commanders became more conservative in their employment of mobile forces. Opportunities for exploitation narrowed, and the initiative increasingly shifted to the Allies. The balance of operational momentum, while still contested, began to favor the side with greater depth, resources, and institutional adaptability. This phase also demonstrated the importance of time as a factor in military effectiveness. The initial mismatch between doctrine and reality at Kasserine was not permanent. Given time and sustained engagement, institutions could absorb lessons and implement change. The key variable was the capacity to recognize failure and respond constructively. By late February and early March 1943, Allied operations in central Tunisia reflected a more mature approach to modern warfare. Command systems functioned more effectively under stress, coordination improved, and the application of combat power became more coherent. While the campaign was far from concluded, the trajectory had shifted. The legacy of Kasserine during this phase was not defined by its immediate tactical outcomes, but by its influence on Allied operational behavior. The battle served as a reference point against which subsequent performance was measured. The lessons drawn informed not only ongoing operations in Tunisia, but also the broader evolution of Allied doctrine and practice as the war progressed. In this sense, the Battle of Kasserine Pass functioned as a formative experience. It exposed institutional weaknesses, compelled reform, and accelerated the process by which doctrine was reconciled with operational reality. The effectiveness of these changes would be tested repeatedly in the campaigns that followed, shaping the Allied approach to combined arms warfare for the remainder of the Second World War. The broader operational consequences of the Battle of Kasserine Pass extended beyond the immediate tactical adjustments observed in the weeks that followed. This phase is best understood by examining how the lessons of Kasserine were institutionalized within Allied planning and how they influenced subsequent operations in the North African campaign. The battle served as a reference point for evaluating command effectiveness, doctrinal applicability, and the integration of coalition forces under sustained operational pressure. As Allied forces resumed offensive operations in Tunisia, the command environment reflected a clearer delineation of authority and responsibility. Coordination between American and British formations improved as procedures were standardized and liaison mechanisms strengthened. While differences in doctrine and experience remained, the urgency created by the earlier setback fostered greater willingness to align operational methods.
This alignment reduced friction at seams between national commands, a critical factor in coalition warfare. Operational planning increasingly emphasized phased objectives supported by concentrated force application. Rather than dispersing units to hold extensive frontages, Allied commanders prioritized the massing of combat power against selected objectives. This approach reflected a departure from earlier defensive assumptions and acknowledged the necessity of maneuver supported by logistics and firepower. The ability to sustain pressure over time became a central planning consideration. The employment of intelligence also evolved during this phase. The shortcomings revealed at Kasserine prompted greater emphasis on synthesizing tactical reports into operational assessments. Intelligence sections at corps and army level refined their analytical processes, improving the correlation between enemy activity and operational intent. While intelligence remained an imperfect instrument, its integration into planning improved situational awareness and reduced the likelihood of strategic surprise. Logistical planning gained increased prominence as an operational determinant. The experience of operating under constrained supply conditions highlighted the need for forward logistics planning aligned with maneuver objectives. Allied commands invested in expanding depots, improving transportation networks, and ensuring redundancy in supply routes.
These measures enhanced operational endurance and reduced vulnerability to disruption. The German response to these Allied adaptations was constrained by the cumulative effects of attrition and isolation. Axis forces in Tunisia faced diminishing resources and limited strategic options. Their ability to exploit Allied weaknesses declined as those weaknesses were addressed. While German units continued to demonstrate tactical competence, they increasingly operated within a reactive framework dictated by Allied initiative. From a doctrinal perspective, the aftermath of Kasserine accelerated the practical integration of combined arms principles. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air support were employed in more coordinated fashion, reflecting lessons learned under combat conditions. The emphasis shifted from theoretical coordination to practiced integration, with command structures reinforcing rather than inhibiting cooperation between arms. The institutionalization of these lessons was evident in training and staff processes. After-action analyses from Kasserine were disseminated and incorporated into operational planning discussions. Commanders at multiple levels referenced the engagement when evaluating risk, force allocation, and control measures. This reflective process contributed to a more realistic appraisal of capabilities and limitations. Importantly, the influence of Kasserine was not confined to American forces. British commanders also reassessed assumptions regarding Allied coordination and the employment of less experienced formations. The engagement underscored the necessity of aligning coalition capabilities and managing disparities in experience through structured command arrangements. The operational tempo of Allied forces increased as confidence in command systems grew. While caution remained, it was informed by experience rather than uncertainty. This shift enabled sustained offensive operations that gradually eroded Axis positions in Tunisia. The convergence of Allied forces from east and west placed increasing pressure on German defenses, limiting their freedom of maneuver. In evaluating this phase, it is essential to distinguish between learning and perfection. The institutional changes prompted by Kasserine did not eliminate friction or guarantee success. However, they reduced the likelihood of systemic failure by addressing the underlying causes exposed during the battle.
The emphasis on adaptability, coordination, and realistic planning became enduring features of Allied operations. The Battle of Kasserine Pass thus occupies a specific analytical position within the North African campaign. It represents a point at which doctrinal assumptions were tested and recalibrated. The value of this experience lay not in the immediate outcome, but in the clarity it provided regarding the relationship between institutional design and operational effectiveness. As Allied forces pressed toward final victory in Tunisia, the lessons of Kasserine informed decision-making at every level. The engagement served as a reminder that numerical superiority and material advantage require effective organizational frameworks to be decisive. Without such frameworks, advantages remain latent. This phase demonstrates how operational setbacks can function as catalysts for institutional learning. The ability of the Allied command to absorb and apply lessons from Kasserine contributed directly to subsequent success. The battle's legacy was therefore not defined by its initial reverses, but by its role in shaping a more effective approach to modern warfare within the Allied coalition. The Battle of Kasserine Pass occupies a distinct place within the analytical history of the Second World War because its significance lies less in territorial outcomes than in institutional transformation. This final phase situates Kasserine within the wider trajectory of Allied operational development and examines its enduring implications for doctrine, command philosophy, and coalition warfare. By the conclusion of the North African campaign in May 1943, the operational environment confronting Allied forces differed markedly from that of February. While material superiority had increased, the decisive change lay in organizational effectiveness. The command structures, procedures, and assumptions that had failed at Kasserine were revised through experience, not abstraction. The battle functioned as a validation mechanism, revealing which aspects of doctrine were viable under combat conditions and which required modification. From a doctrinal standpoint,
Kasserine clarified the limits of centralized control in fast-moving operations. Pre-war American doctrine had emphasized detailed planning and hierarchical decision-making as safeguards against uncertainty. Combat experience demonstrated that these safeguards could become liabilities when they constrained initiative and delayed response. The post-Kasserine shift toward clearer intent and decentralized execution reflected a pragmatic recalibration rather than doctrinal rejection. The engagement also reinforced the operational importance of reserves and concentration of force. The dispersal of units across wide fronts intended to ensure coverage proved ineffective against a maneuver-oriented opponent. Kasserine demonstrated that the ability to mass combat power at decisive points outweighed the perceived security of continuous lines. This lesson influenced Allied planning throughout the remainder of the war, particularly in operations requiring rapid exploitation. Coalition warfare emerged as another critical dimension. Kasserine exposed the friction inherent in multinational command arrangements, including differences in experience, doctrine, and communication practices. The subsequent improvements in liaison, coordination, and command clarity did not eliminate these challenges, but they established mechanisms to manage them. These mechanisms proved essential in later campaigns, involving even larger coalition forces. Logistics, while not the primary cause of failure at Kasserine, were revealed as an operational constraint that required integration into planning at all levels. The battle underscored that maneuver capability is inseparable from sustainment capacity. The post-Kasserine emphasis on forward logistics planning and redundancy reflected a more realistic appreciation of this relationship. The German perspective on Kasserine further illuminates its analytical value. Axis commanders achieved operational disruption through effective application of doctrine, but were unable to convert that success into strategic advantage. Their limitations were structural rather than tactical, shaped by resource scarcity and strategic isolation. Kasserine thus illustrates the distinction between operational competence and strategic viability. In the broader context of the war, Kasserine marked a transition point for the U.S. Army. It was the first large-scale engagement in which American forces confronted a modern, experienced opponent under unfavorable conditions. The outcome exposed weaknesses that could not be concealed by material strength alone. The institutional response demonstrated a capacity for adaptation that would become a defining characteristic of Allied success. Importantly, the lessons of Kasserine were not confined to North Africa. They informed Allied operations in Sicily, Italy, and Northwest Europe, where command flexibility, combined arms integration, and logistical planning proved decisive. The engagement became a reference case in professional military education, illustrating the consequences of doctrinal misalignment and the potential for corrective action. Analytically, the Battle of Kasserine Pass reinforces a central principle of military history. Doctrine is a hypothesis tested by combat. Its validity is determined not by theoretical coherence, but by performance under operational pressure. Kasserine demonstrated how institutional assumptions shape battlefield behavior and how failure can generate reform when recognized and addressed. The battle also challenges simplistic interpretations of success and failure.
While the engagement resulted in Allied withdrawal and temporary loss of ground, its longer-term effect was to strengthen Allied operational effectiveness. Conversely, German tactical success did not alter the strategic trajectory of the campaign. This asymmetry highlights the importance of evaluating military events within their institutional and strategic context. In conclusion, the Battle of Kasserine Pass should be understood as a diagnostic event rather than a decisive one. It revealed the gap between doctrine and operational reality at a critical moment in the war. The Allied response to this revelation, measured, institutional, and adaptive, demonstrates how military organizations learn under pressure. Kasserine did not determine the outcome of the North African campaign, but it shaped how that outcome was achieved. Its enduring significance lies in the clarity it provided regarding the relationship between theory and practice in modern warfare. For an institution prepared to learn, failure became a mechanism for improvement. In this sense,
The Battle of Kasserine Pass stands as a case study in adaptation, not anomaly, within the broader history of Allied operations in the Second World War.